From movement to medicine, climate change in our future, everything depends on energy. We use it to drive us, we use it to heal us. This is The Coefficient Life, and we sit down with the smartest scientists, futurists and thinkers on the planet to discuss the big ideas around energy in all its forms and ask the questions you wish you could ask them. I'm your host, Anthony Salomon.
And I'm your other host, Kim Brooks. Anthony and I are here to bring you stories that are shaping the future of our planet. Now let's dive on into a universe of energy.
From the Podcast Bureau, this is The Coefficient Life.
Ever wanted to talk to the guy who's in the know about climate change, clean and renewable energy, and how to save the planet? Well, we did. We got to sit down with Tim Lieuwen, the Executive Director of the Strategic Energy Institute and the International Authority on Clean Energy. Tim has authored and edited 4 books, holds 5 patents, and is the founder of TurbineLogic, and is a multi-award-winning scientist who sits on the advisory boards of the Oak Ridge NASA Lab, Pacific Northwest National Lab, and the National Renewable Energy Lab.
We were lucky enough to grab some of Tim's time and get into a very high-level discussion about how to change the future of the environment, as well as some of the realities behind the real impacts of the things we are doing, not just in hurting the environment, but the things we are doing to protect and save it.
Has a Tesla, and one of his ideas is, in what conditions is my Tesla environmentally friendly?
Yeah.
And,
if at all.
And, again, how does the nexus of energy and where we get our energy sources come from, and, what are the synergies that bring things together that make sense, and what are the synergies that we're doing that may not make sense?
Yeah.
Looking at also what the future of energy is with regards to, obviously, renewables is, obviously there, but everything has its pros and cons.
Yep.
So, looking forward into the future, how do we offset some of the cons of solar and wind? And do we supplement with nuclear, or what do we do, right? How is everybody working hand in hand to make sure that we have like great energy going into the future?
Yep. Yeah. Firm dispatchable power, I guess, is the $1 million question.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I don't know if you had a specific question, or you guys just want to.
No, if I thought
about
really just have an informal conversation,
Sure.
And sort of look into what you do here and what kind of stuff you're doing right now and looking to do in the near and then the long-term future.
Sure.
And then your prognostications to the extent you're comfortable giving those.
Sure, yeah.
Where are we going, and where do we need to go?
Yeah.
Well, I guess the first point I would make is, when we talk about energy, that's the U.S. really has 2 kind of completely independent energy ecosystems. One is kind of the electric power, and the other is transportation. They have totally different geopolitics. They have totally different pricing structures, totally different sets of issues. And so I think, I guess that's just point one, is when we talk about energy, probably there's there's obviously there's the electricity side, and then there's the transportation side. And that's so if we think about on the electricity side, it's decarbonizing rapidly. I think what we are starting to see are kind of the growing pains where renewables, where intermittent energy sources, not non-firm, non-dispatchable power, is starting to become a significant enough fraction that it's starting to become a stress point.
A problem.
Texas is Exhibit A, right? What happened in Texas is Exhibit A. Well, wind just tanked. On the other hand, some days last year, Texas, more than 50% of its energy came from renewables, which is, you say, hey, that's cool, but then also recognize, you still got to have all
about the bad days,
all that firm dispatchable power on the off days. So that's kind of key issue number one. And so, and photovoltaic, solar and wind are the lowest cost options. And they're going to go like gangbusters. And the biggest hurdle right now with getting more, particularly wind on the grid, it's not a technical issue. It's just the transmission lines and getting all the right of ways and states to get them to where they go. For example, Southern Company, which is our regional utility, is a regulated, vertically integrated utility, but they also have a non-regulated business. They're investing in Midwestern solar farms, Midwestern wind farms, but they've been actually pulling a bunch of projects off the table because they can't get the interconnects. So it's a lot of non-technical issues, which is stymieing that. I guess just the other point I would just throw out there is that some people see there's a huge difference between getting to net zero CO2 and getting to absolute zero CO2. And, and net zero CO2 is far and away the cheapest way to do it.
Yeah.
Because particularly once you start looking at, 50, once we start reducing our CO2 by 50%, 75%, that last bit starts to get really expensive. So there's a really nice study that was just done by Princeton. It's called Net Zero America. I don't know if you're familiar with it.
No.
Where it was kind of cool. They basically like engineers, they put together this macro model of the U.S. energy system. And, obviously there's a lot of macro models of the U.S. energy system, but really fine grained in terms of space and time. And then they just wrapped an optimizer around it. Just like, how do we get to net zero cheap? So really cool, kind of an engineering approach.
Wow, that is good.
But what's really interesting about that is like 25% of our energy in that scenario comes from fossil fuels, but with carbon capture. So it's like fossil fuels aren't going away.
Yeah. There's just too much of it available. It's too readily available.
Yeah, but carbon capture.
So you're talking about the systems like when they capture the carbon, pump it into the earth, turn it into rock, that kind of stuff.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah.
So you got direct air capture, which is where it's very dilute. Like, are you familiar with this plant in Iceland that's went online this year?
Yeah.
So yeah, there's a plant in Iceland. It's powered by geothermal energy, and it's literally pulling in air. And air is 400 parts per million of CO2. It's sucking that 400 ppm of CO2 out, pumping it down to turn it into rock. They have this basalt. And so that's called direct air capture. The other is concentrated capture, where you pull it
Out of an exhaust stream.
Yeah, out of an exhaust stream. It's expensive though, right? And frankly,
I would think so, yeah.
The U.S., the cost of carbon, the U.S. has something called the 45Q credit, which is actually, it's in the IRS tax code, where if you pull CO2 out of the air, they're going to give you, I think, $45 per ton or something like that. So it's actually already there. The problem is there's no technology that can get you there today at $45. At $100 a ton, then you're going to start to see some really interesting things happen in this country, because then the Exxon Mobils and the Chevrons and companies that know how to do big stuff are going to see money in it.
That'd be really.
It's going to
Tim, I can put you on the spot, but like when we talk about emissions or anthropogenic emissions of CO2 in terms of tons, like what order of magnitude are we talking about as far as what North America or even the world emits? I mean,
a
million? Is it a billion? Is it? I mean, I know it's a big number.
There's a really cool book. It's by Bill Gates called How to Avoid Climate Crisis, and he has these numbers, and it's billions of tons, I believe.
Yeah, I think it is.
Yeah.
So you had a lot of Iceland plants to take care of that problem.
So to me, the future is growing renewables, but also a significant non-zero fraction of fossil fuels with carbon capture.
Yeah.
I think that's just where the
You mean for electricity production, not for transportation?
Yeah, for electricity, yes. We'll talk about transportation in a second, but I think, and then the other thing I would just add to that is, obviously everybody talks about storage as being a key enabler, no question, but sometimes it's lost in those conversations as well. There's storage over a second, there's storage over a minute, there's storage over a few hours, there's storage over days, and there's storage over months, right? And so a lot of the discussion around, lithium ion batteries and these, how California is creating a market for energy storage, that's all like a few hours to a few days type storage. Yeah. And that is there is a very real need for that. They've got the duck curve and
emergency stuff, emergency power.
Yeah.
And pumped water, even sometimes pumped water is even, I've seen that done.
Yeah, pumped hydro.
Pump it up and then regenerate it. Yeah.
And by the way, I don't know if you know this, but the state of Alabama is the site of the only compressed air energy storage facility in the United States.
Wow, I didn't know that.
There's two in the world. One's in Alabama, right next to us, where they pump compressed air into a cavern.
Wow. That's pretty cool.
Comes flying back out.
And you use it for work. Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of cool. But the problem, I don't think pumped hydro is scalable.
It's not scalable.
It's not scalable.
You don't have it everywhere.
But that's where things like, so really I think kind of the question that we don't have quite figured out yet is weeks to months to seasonal type storage.
Yeah.
And that's where I think things like hydrogen or other chemical energy carriers starts to become. So again, if you look at that Princeton study, today there is a hydrogen economy. It's largely a petrochemical. It's largely locally on site. Petrochem companies take methane. They use steam to turn methane into hydrogen, and you can actually capture the CO2. That's in fact the essence of the ExxonMobil Houston port proposal for a direct air capture hub. And then you've got that hydrogen. But what we're going to see is this renewable fuel economy. It's going to become a very, very large economy.
You mean with cracking hydrogen out of other streams?
Well, it could be that, but I guess generally, so if you think about electricity, it's not a source of energy, it's a carrier of energy, right? We just move it. We have something which gives you the energy, nuclear power, wind, burning, coal. Electricity just carries you from point A to point B. Today, fossil fuels carry three functions. They're the source of energy, they're the carrier of energy, and they're the storage medium of energy.
Yeah, they store it also. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and, it's a pile of coal. It's a great battery, right?
Right.
But those are going to get deconstructed. The market, the energy market is going to deconstruct those, because as we move away, as we do a lot less fossil fuels, not zero, but still substantially reduced, what's going to be the carrier of energy? What's going to be the storage medium of energy?
Yeah.
So electricity is going to go up. We're going to use more electricity. Electricity as a carrier, but we're also going to see a whole new set of carriers like hydrogen or even liquid fuels. So completely synthetically generated liquid fuels, particularly for sectors like aviation.
Yes.
Where it looks just like Jet A, but it's made by, what is Jet A? It's a bunch of carbon and hydrogen atoms.
Yeah.
But you synthetically put them together.
Where
Using
does
renewable energy.
I sat in a presentation on basically using nuclear power for coal liquefaction this week, and they were saying this is what we got to do. Again, one researcher, but within that is coal liquefaction part of the problem or part of the solution, or I don't even know.
Yeah, that's called. Are you familiar with those like green hydrogen and pink hydrogen?
That's
and
green
hydrogen. That's black hydrogen.
Oh, that's black hydrogen. Okay.
But one conceivably could use coal. And in fact, if you fly out of South Africa today, you are flying on liquefied coal.
Oh, really?
Yeah. You familiar with the company Sasol? SASOL?
No.
So Sasol is a South African company, and I think it goes back to the days.
Yeah, I've heard of that actually.
Yeah, and they have a huge petrochemical complex where in comes coal, out goes jet fuel. And so a lot of the engines, the jet engines, are certified to fly on 50% of this stuff. In fact, the U.S. Department of Defense in the late 2000s had a goal that by 2015 they were going to be using 50% domestically sourced fuel, because this was before fracking. Huge national security issue. Oh, by the way, our national security, all of our fighter planes are pulling oil from a region we may be at war with, like Iran or something. And so 50% of the fuel was going to be domestically sourced. It was before fracking. And so the solution was coal-derived fuels. And so it's actually, by the way, the technology was developed in World War II by German engineers when they lost the oil fields.
Yeah, they make coal oil, they called it. You used to burn it to heat the houses with. Coal oil.
Yeah, exactly.
Stuff like kerosene. Yeah, I've seen that. Yeah.
Yeah, so you take coal. If you heat up coal and air is around, it's going to burn. If you heat up coal and you don't have air,
it sweats it out.
Yeah, what you get is hydrogen and carbon monoxide. And so that's town gas, what used to be called town gas, like in Great Britain.
Yeah.
And you can burn that stuff. It's called synthesis gas. Or you can then run that through a catalyst, and it's called the Fischer-Tropsch process. These are the two Germans who invented it. You run this over this catalyst, and bingo, out pops gasoline or kerosene or
whatever you want.
And so, but that basic technology, although it was invented for coal, all you need is hydrogen and CO2.
It could be other feedstock besides coal.
So you can take water, you can split it, you can pull CO2 out of the air, run it through that same catalyst.
But you need an energy source to do that with.
You need an energy source to do it. So it's sort of the best available technology today. I think you're probably talking about $6 or $7 a gallon if you were to make gasoline.
Make it that way.
Yeah.
So before you were talking about synthetically creating things by putting, different molecules and atoms together.
Yep.
But then it creates something that's in line with a fossil fuel. What is the emission of that?
Yeah.
Is it clean or is it?
Yeah, no, that's a great question.
So burn the same.
Our society has a couple really big decisions to make. Like I said, the thing about electrification is that your toaster, your Tesla, it doesn't care if the power ultimately comes from a nuclear plant or coal.
Mm-hmm.
Electricity is drop-in. Electricity is electricity. And the thing about electricity, it's super easy to change it. You can make it, it can be 120,000 volts, or it can be 120 volts, it can be DC, it can be AC. It's like a chameleon without a whole lot of losses in efficiency. Fuels and chemical energy carriers are much harder to kind of change that modality.
More entropy in moving those around.
Yeah, bingo. Right, that's exactly right. And so we have a couple really big decisions to make, which is that, oh, by the way, we have 2.1 million miles of pipelines in this country. Are we just going to throw those away?
Yeah.
Or we've got however many hundreds of millions of automobiles with internal combustion engines. Are we just going to stop? Or, we've got airplanes. So the one question is we use the word drop-in. So are we going to use chemical energy carriers that are drop-in, that look just like gasoline or just like kerosene? Or are we going to use something that you'd actually have to get a new car for? So, if it's hydrogen, you can't use your car.
Yeah.
I can't use my car. My It was actually my in-laws' car that I drove in on. I can't run hydrogen on it, right? So drop-in versus non-drop-in. It turns out that if we were to build society from scratch, we would use fuels. We would use different chemical energy carriers than we have today. Hydrogen's really cheap to produce. It's hard to move it around. And you need a new car for it.
Yeah.
On the other hand, drop-in, we can leverage those 2.1 million miles of pipelines. You can continue doing the other things you do. It's just more expensive to make. Like I said, it costs $7 a gallon to make it. But your question was slightly different, which was the emissions. And so there's two kinds of emissions we worry about. One is carbon dioxide emissions. The other is stuff that causes air quality problems, like Atlanta has a smog problem. So you can conceivably make these things net zero CO2. So from a carbon dioxide point of view, you can use wind turbines to drive this process to synthetically make a drop-in fuel. No problem.
Yeah.
But the next question comes, when you use it, does it make smog, what we call NOx and particulates or soot? Right. And the answer to that question is if not careful, you can.
Yeah.
You can make pollution. Just like burning, logs are biofuels, right? Those are net zero CO2, but the reason forest fires make a lot of soot is, even though it's not making net CO2 in the environment, it's still making the air quality bad. But on the other hand, what I do for a living is I do combustion, right? Before I ran the Energy Institute. And so you can do a lot of things to make these things super duper clean. Near zero. Not zero, but near zero.
But near zero, yeah.
Yeah, near zero.
That's really interesting, yeah.
Yeah, and actually it turns out that today's, take gasoline. One of the challenges with gasoline, if you actually wanted to make an exact carbon copy of gasoline, is it has thousands of different compounds in it. And so, but yet there's a few basic features that you try to capture, which is how much heat you get per pound and the viscosity.
Right.
So you can simulate that pretty easily. So it turns out that Fischer-Tropsch fuels, these synthetically generated fuels, have no aromatics, which are carbon chains, and it's aromatics that make soot. So it turns out that these drop-in fuels make essentially no soot or particulates, whereas entirely by accident for serendipitous reasons, whereas natural fossil fuel stuff, because it's got a lot of aromatics, makes soot.
Interesting.
Yeah,
that's going to be good for LA.
yeah. But we can talk about transport. I feel like I'm rambling. Just if you want.
No, please. This is amazing. Yeah.
So we're talking about electricity. Maybe to talk about transportation for a minute. So, like I said, today the transportation sector is totally decoupled. Essentially 2% of existing
vehicles are
electric. Yeah, I think we're up to 10% now of new sales or something
maybe,
like that.
Yeah.
But it's still small. And so we're basically using fossil fuels and we're using a liquid fuel. And so maybe I'll just emphasize that for a minute, is that one really interesting thing to look at are fuel prices in this country or energy prices. So, you're probably used to gasoline costs so many dollars per gallon, or if you track natural gas prices, it's quoted as dollars per million BTU. But if you actually were to take energy costs and just normalize, or fuel costs and normalize it by energy. So for example, instead of dollars per gallon or dollars per barrel of oil, dollars per joule of energy.
Say joule, yeah.
It turns out that if you look at the United States, there's basically two different price structures. If the fuel is a gas at room temperature, that's natural gas and that's ethane. I don't know if you're used to thinking about ethane, but it turns out that a lot of U.S. fracked gas has ethane. That's natural gas and ethane. Or on the other hand, if it's a liquid at room temperature, so that's gasoline, that's propane, etc., the market is going to give you 4 to 5 times per unit of energy. It's going to pay you if you own those. Or on the other hand, if you're a consumer, you're going to have to pay 4 to 5 times as much if it's a liquid versus a gas. In places like Japan and Korea, those are priced on an energy basis.
Is that just purely due to the weight or the storage? Or?
Yeah, well, it's really interesting. It's because the U.S. is so energy abundant, right? Energy is cheap in the U.S. The problem is it's hard to move stuff that's a gas out. So gas, we export, today the U.S. exports, I think, 13% of our natural gas. But it's a big price premium, right? Like in the U.S., I think gas is, for the last couple of years, it's been $2 or $3 per million BTU. It costs almost double that to ship it to Korea. It costs it $5. Turns out that's still cheap relative to what you pay. Versus oil and things like that, that's really easy to move. And so there's a pretty common global benchmark. So what you pay for oil in Japan versus in Russia versus Europe versus the US isn't that different, because it only costs about $1 per barrel to ship the stuff. So when you're talking about $60 a barrel, 61 versus 59. There's just not that much of a difference. So it's globally priced. It's set on a global market versus stuff that's a gas, since it costs a lot more. US pricing is totally different than European pricing, which is totally different than Asian pricing. So for that reason, the US burns a lot of natural gas. We're starting to export more, but it just makes it super cheap. Versus transportation, we pay a premium for those fuels. So that's one thing. So now if you start talking about electrifying the transportation fleet, you're starting to pull from these much cheaper fuels, which is why total cost of ownership of electric vehicles is actually already sort of running on the run for the money with, conventional cars. Even though they cost more to buy, you just aggregate just what you pay at the pump versus your higher electricity bills.
Yeah, every time I charge my Tesla, it says, you saved this much at the pump today.
Yeah.
Like, great.
Yeah, but that's why. It's because, it's using, even if it's using a fossil fuel, more than likely it's using coal or natural gas, I know you wanted to get to that question about emissions from it.
Yeah.
Which is really cheap in the US, super cheap. Versus if you're using oil, it's like, well, shoot, I'm just going to go sell this to the Japanese because they're going to pay me a lot. Because Japan has no energy sources, so they're buying everything. So that's why they pay the same on an energy basis for oil as they do for natural gas.
Yeah. No, I definitely want to get into that emissions question because I think it was you that sent me an article the other day, and it was like, if you live in Colorado,
Rick sent some articles.
You're not as clean as you think when you drive an EV. And then it kind of showed you, depending on where you live, how you stack up against a traditional combustion engine.
Yep.
Which I found it fascinating.
Yep. But I think Rich, you're meeting with afterwards, this is what he does all day, every day. So I will defer the detailed answer to that question because there's a lot of nuance. I guess the only thing I would just say is I think you have to differentiate between sort of aggregate lifetime CO2 emissions and what you're generating at that point, because by you buying an EV, you're enabling a market that's ultimately going to enable some of these broader trends, right? How do we drive down emissions from transportation? It's really hard to get rid of CO2, right?
Yeah.
Stationary sources, it's much easier. So how do we do that? The best way to do that, at least for smaller cars, is by electrifying them. And how do we do that? It's by having lots of people buy them. Well, how do we get lots of people to buy them if they're cheap? So we need early adopters, right? And so we've got to create that market. We need market makers. So you're a market maker.
Amazing. Thank you. I try.
You're a market maker. So what you're doing today and what you're enabling 10 years from now are two totally different answers. Even if you were you're charging your car in the middle of coal country.
Yeah.
And so I guess that would be my kind of big picture answer to that question.
Tim, I heard a resurgence in hydrogen discussions, and I think we had some conversations about that more. We're within transportation. Is hydrogen going to be something we're just still talking about in 20 years? Or do you think hydrogen will ever be a player with cars?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think, the answer to this question on transportation comes down to vehicle size and mass, right? So for small size, small mass things like my car, your car, electrification wins. I think we've answered that question. I know some people, you probably know some people who have fuel cell powered vehicles, and they probably are looking for hydrogen stations to power it. I think that is a sunk cost asset. I don't see that becoming, it just doesn't pencil out. Electricity is just, by the time you make the hydrogen and you do all this stuff, it's just a lot more expensive. Now, on the other hand, as you start looking at trucking, long haul trucking, hydrogen with a fuel cell starts to make economic sense. So there is very clear motion on that. So think marine, think big trucks, think aviation. That's probably not going to electrify. That's going to use some sort of chemical energy carrier. So whether that's a fuel, whether that's hydrogen, possibly for like trucks, versus aircraft, it's going to be a renewable liquid fuel. That's my silver ball. Take that one to the bank.
Yeah.
I'll bet my house on that.
And then, so I just very quickly sort of glanced across like marine travel.
Yeah.
Do you think it'd be more of like hydrogen with a cell, or like for aircraft that they would use to sort of stop putting emissions into the ocean?
For a ship, so aircraft are they're both weight and volume sensitive. And so liquids make sense. I think for a ship, gas makes a lot of sense. In fact, I don't fully understand why every ship in this country today isn't utilizing natural gas. And I think the only reason is that because gas, like I said, it's literally 5 times cheaper. Go look it up on the spot prices.
Yeah. Well, I just like on that topic, I know Disney Cruise Line have now updated all of their ships to be natural gas.
Yeah, that's why. But you're sort of making a bet on future price of natural gas.
Yeah.
Is what you're doing, because 2005 natural gas was 5 times more expensive than it is today, and it was actually priced much more closely to liquid fuels. But it's like we've got so much fracked gas available. Unless there were some policy changes, it's going to continue to be really cheap.
Yeah. Fascinating.
Yeah.
What other questions do I have for you?
But I guess the other question you're asking about hydrogen. So I think there's two angles around hydrogen too.
Yeah, I was going to follow up with hydrogen because as I think about what you just said for a moment, it strikes me. I agree with you. You have a certain mass threshold where it makes sense now with EVs for personal use. But at some point, you have to, if you say you're a market adapter and you try to get 300 million people to be transported by however many million cars that is, that's a heck of a pile of millions of cadmium or batteries to dispose of.
Yeah, no, that's a great question.
And so doesn't hydrogen come back into the equation again for those?
No, I don't think anyone knows the answer to this question.
Yeah, I don't think so either. I was curious if you did. I was hoping that you did, but I didn't think anybody did.
Well, and if I knew the answer to the question, I know what stocks I'd be buying. It would be companies selling lithium,
Yeah, it would be.
And cobalt and stuff.
You see people already hedging that and going there and getting speculating.
Oh, absolutely.
But you do have to, it is kind of an engineering question. The sensitivity analysis is an engineering analysis.
Yeah, so there's a couple questions. So I think one is today you need these rare earths. And so, half the world's cobalt comes from the country of Congo, right? And most of the world's, I can't remember which one comes. It's Australia, maybe lithium is more than 50%.
Well, lithium, we did a whole documentary on lithium. Yeah. Lithium, a lot of it comes from South America, from Bolivia, directly underneath all the quinoa farms.
Okay.
That's why. So the only reason we know this is because there's an element that's in quinoa that you need for your body for functioning, and the only place you can get it is quinoa because it grows on top of lithium farms.
Didn't know that. Okay, There you go.
And that's why it's in the superfood category. And we learned that when we were doing the documentary.
Okay.
So we should link the Tesla batteries.
That's right. That's right.
I don't know about that.
Yeah.
But
I learned, by the way, there are lithium mines in North Carolina. I had no idea that the U.S. had going concerns. But
all right. Yeah.
But so I guess just a couple. So with the current situation, whether we have enough raw product to meet this demand is a great question.
It is.
But then the other question is recyclability.
What do you do with it after?
Yeah, whether
that might work.
There's a lot of science that's going on right now.
Right. Rich was the same thing with like fuel cells. With some of the precious metals in fuel cells, of whether or not it's sustainable or expandable.
Well, that might be also a problem. That might be the problem too. There might be stuff in gotchas in fuel cells.
The U.S. Department of Energy and whatnot, they're dumping big bucks into this issue of recyclability. How do you design these things so that it's low cost and simple to just be turning this stuff around? So it's not. And then the other piece is there's a lot of investments that are going on in trying to develop technologies that don't require these rare earths, that use, more commonly available materials. Yeah. So that's why no one knows the answer to your question.
Yeah. It's just it's in flux. The answer is being solved as we speak, right?
In my opinion, the market's going to solve this problem, right? Because the price signals are going to drive people. They're going to drive innovation. Whether it's because these high efficiency electric motors, these high efficiency batteries, they use these materials because it's because of certain efficiency reasons and whatnot. But people will figure out other ways to do it as prices start moving.
Yeah, I suspect so.
Yeah.
Or it'll create a problem, and we got to solve that problem. That's the new problem. All the poison created by all these electric vehicle batteries.
But I mean, just this question, but it's a really interesting question of whether we have enough lithium for all the lithium-ion batteries we're talking about building. But the other thing I was going to say about hydrogen, by the way, is there's a transportation piece, but then the other piece around hydrogen, why we're hearing more about it, is, again, it goes back to this question of, as you start, when solar and wind are 1% of the grid, 2% of the grid, you can just keep putting solar and wind on the grid and not think about, hold on, I've got this larger system I've got to keep stable. Where the supply of electricity and the demand for electricity have to match, every second in time. And, even if it matches 90% of the time, it doesn't match 10% of the time. That's not good enough.
That's totally unacceptable.
It's 99% isn't acceptable.
No.
It's got to be like 99.9.
Well, you need 110%. You need overage.
Yeah. And so there's so much so this is where questions like hydrogen come in, is essentially using it for long duration energy storage. Because
you force it into that. You basically put the energy and you store it as potential energy by breaking this chemical apart. Now it's potential energy again.
Yeah, exactly. It's a chemical energy carrier rather than electrical.
Yes, right. Yep. That's right.
And so, for example, I mentioned the U.S. has got I said 2.1 million miles. I can't remember what breakdown that is for gasoline versus oil versus natural gas, but
it's a lot.
Let's just say 1 million miles of pipelines of natural gas, which, by the way, is rated for probably, I don't think anyone knows exactly the number, but somewhere up to about 20%, you can put hydrogen in it before you start to embrittle. You get this problem called hydrogen embrittlement.
The pipes, yeah.
Yeah, it starts to ruin the pipes. But let's just say it's only 5%. I mean, if we could put 5% hydrogen into our existing natural gas pipelines, that is a massive battery. That is a massive battery. And, you know, all the things that are using that natural gas, they can take a certain amount of hydrogen.
Yeah, they can.
So, well, that's what I guess I was going to get at. So can you take a gas turbine engine, dope it also, I mean, maybe doping is the wrong word, but add some extra hydrogen to it, and then it will burn?
No, this is my world. I mean, I've got lots of active DOE programs working on exactly this.
It burns just like regular hydrogen, doesn't it?
Yeah, well, it turns out that I mentioned how you have to be careful to not make pollution. When you burn a fossil fuel, if you're not careful, you can make smog and soot. But modern combustion systems are really clean, but you got to be careful. And hydrogen, if you start dumping a lot of hydrogen into those systems, you can damage them. And so there's a lot of work going on right now to develop systems that are fuel flexible. And the reason you need fuel flexible is that if you said, hey, I got 100% hydrogen, can you run that through a gas turbine? I'd say no problem. But if I have to have a gas turbine that can run from pure methane, pure natural gas, all the way to pure hydrogen and vary by the day, that becomes a challenge. And that's where a lot of the innovation is happening.
Does water? Because when you combust hydrogen, you're basically going to water.
Yep.
What do you do with all the water in your combustion engine or whatever?
Goes out into the back end of steam.
So it just goes out of steam?
Yeah. So, you know, when you see images of power plants with these horrible exhaust stacks, you're not seeing pollution, you're seeing steam condensing.
I understand that very well.
But that's not the exhaust of the power plant, though.
Pardon?
That's not the exhaust, the cooling tower.
That's the cooling
exchange.
tower.
Yeah, exactly. But this is what, when you see an image about...
Like on the news, you watch the news.
So side
see
story real
those
quick.
two
When I
big
was an
cooling
undergraduate
stacks.
at University of
They think that's the
Maryland,
nuclear
the
stuff.
Baltimore Sun, which is the paper there, did a bad... wanted to do an anti-nuke story. And so they went down the coast there, the Chesapeake Bay, looking for Calvert Cliffs nuclear power plant, which, by the way, has no cooling tower. It just heat exchanges with the Chesapeake Bay. And they found like some coal plant with these big cooling towers. Took this picture of like cooling towers and coal plant and basically was like, you know, posted that as the front page story about the evils of nuclear. And they got a coal fire plant there, and that was just 1980s. The conical cooling towers are always associated with nuclear power, but big coal plants have them too. So.
But when you see the exhaust stack with a dark color, that's so that is pollution. Or like a diesel truck.
My scattering versus rally scattering.
That's right.
Well, you just got to apply the principles of smoking a brisket, right? You want like the almost see-through white, like clean smoke. You don't want that black sooty smoke to cook your brisket. Exactly. Same with the planet, right? We don't want the black smoke to cook the planet. We want the nice white, almost transparent smoke to be coming out of there because that's just water vapor.
Yep. But I guess I was just going to say that's the other big driver for hydrogen is essentially it's a long duration energy storage medium.
Yeah.
You know, that's not transportation. That's just electric.
Yeah. The interesting thing is then how do you restructure infrastructure for all of these? This is something that we just dealt with on the way here is all this infrastructure needed for these alternate fuel vehicles. So for, you know, electric transportation, how do you then make sure that we all have these chargers along the route? Because everybody's got their own proprietary charging nozzle. So now you have to have all these charging stations.
You have to carry around 400 pounds of converters in each electric vehicle.
And then you go over to the UK and you need a whole other one again.
Exactly. But, you know, the UK is actually piloting some really interesting hydrogen stuff. In fact, I think it was just in the news this week what they're doing to the northeast part of the UK. They're gonna put out a big hydrogen pilot. And I think it's the city of Leeds. The city of Leeds, I think the piping is already plastic, I think is why they can do it in Leeds. And I don't completely understand the reasons for this. Because like I said, with hydrogen, you can use existing metal piping probably up to about 20%, but not beyond that. Whereas if you've got the piping that can already take it, you can run 100% hydrogen.
Wow, that's interesting, yeah. So because I don't understand what it does, what does hydrogen do to like the metal pipes?
So somehow, because it's so small and diffusive, it actually gets in there and it just makes it weak. So this was actually, as I understand it, was discovered by these same German people who invented this process, is that they had these very high pressure containers, and one day they just had a huge explosion. And going back in, they realized it's what calls it embrittles the irons. You get what's called hydrogen embrittlement.
Well, hydrogen embrittlement was also caused, I mean, they got a lot of failures due to that. I thought that the BP oil disaster was due to hydrogen embrittlement of the screws. Basically.
It could have been. I mean, we burn a lot of hydrogen.
We did a lot of work on this for BP in Texas because we have nuclear engineering world, we have a technique called prompt neutron activation analysis. You basically hit it, and if there's hydrogen absorbs a neutron and gives off a very characteristic gamma ray, so you can quantify it. And so we did all this work. We did for the oil industry in Texas. We did all this work on hydrogen embrittlement. But that was the problem there, is that underwater within I guess that was it, is that the marine environment allowed for quicker hydrogen embrittlement of those stainless steel.
And here, this is why we now don't use hydrogen to power boats. Okay, fantastic.
Well, I mean, you just have to be careful about what you're containing in it.
Yeah.
But hydrogen embrittlement, we have these hydrogen embrittle. We would hydrogen embrittle these purposefully, these metals, and bring them to failure. And you could just see like a system, like you have tension on it, and then you start embrittling it with hydrogen, and it was catastrophic failures. It wasn't one of these things like, oh, it just starts to stretch and then it's there. It is like a pop that sounds like a gunshot down the hallway.
Yeah.
But
I mean, if you're putting in new infrastructure, no problem. The problem is existing infrastructure. So that's why, like the existing natural gas pipelines, it's actually drop in. We could start dumping hydrogen. There's no reason we couldn't start dumping it in tomorrow, right?
Yeah, but and then I guess it's the same for all of these gas stations around the country. You could just start dropping in, your new fuel source, like that new liquid fuel source, whatever it happens to be, for a vehicle, rather than saying, well, we're going to rip all those tanks out of the ground, put in electric charging stations, whatever it might be.
Yeah, drop in. That's that word it came from the aviation industry, because again, like take the this company Sasol, they had to be very careful to engineer the chemical manufacturing process so that the fuel was drop in. That you didn't have to change your jet engine out if you're flying out of Johannesburg. It could be the same jet engine, same.
It's interesting. You say this, it reminds me. Why don't, instead of still fooling around with putting ethanol in the gasoline, why don't we just put hydrogen into it and stop doing ethanol? I mean, what's the reason? Why do we still do ethanol? Is that for the same reason?
Oh, farm lobby.
There's no engineering reason why.
That's going to be like corn subsidies, right?
Yeah. So I'm sure there's an energy density issue. Hydrogen being a gas and ethanol being a liquid, I'm sure that there's less energy density.
Yeah, there must be. Yeah, but still.
But I mean, at the end of the day, ethanol.
How much carbon do you burn to get the corn and then get the ethanol at the beginning?
Yeah.
I think the total cost of the thing.
Yeah, you can think of ethanol as it's an energy carrier. It's not an energy source. It's
it's carrying energy, a lot of energy.
Yeah. Domestically produced.
Some of it's not readily available.
Domestically produced Midwestern energy.
Yes.
Gotcha. Well, very good, Tim. I don't mean to take up too much of your time.
No, this is super fun. I enjoyed it. But I always like BSing about big picture.
Awesome.
Big picture stuff.
Well, I'm going to sit down and listen to this again, and we'll get some questions for you.
Yeah.
And we'll do it again.
So my 30-second summary of what's the future of energy, electrification of transport, it's large-scale carbon capture, it's sort of hydrogen and other kind of alternative chemical energy carriers, and then I think also the growing use of electric power for a lot of things that we use IC engines for today.
Amazing.
Those are all things you can take to the bank. I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, but I guarantee you there's just too strong techno-economic drivers for all those.
Yeah. Great. So just on the way home, remind me what stocks to buy in these sectors. Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, you bet. Enjoyed it.
It was great meeting you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for listening. And remember, you can find the Coefficient Life podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you have a topic you want to hear more about, follow us on social media and message us through Facebook. Remember, energy is everywhere. Use yours wisely.